The morning Jedediah Underwood rode into the valley of Sweetwater Creek. The sun was cutting long gold ribbons across the Kansas plains, and he had exactly $43, a mule named Persimmon, and a land claim he had won in a card game off a half-drunk trapper who swore the property had been sitting empty for 2 full years. He had no reason to doubt the man. The trapper, a wiry fellow named Crook Hannigan, had spread the deed across the saloon table in Dodge City with the casual confidence of someone offering a worthless trinket. And when Jedediah had laid down his 3 aces, Crook had slapped the deed into his palm and told him the place was called the Alcott Homestead, named after the family that had built it before the fever took them all in the winter of 1877. It was now 1879. And Kansas was still a land where a man with a strong back and a stubborn disposition could make something from nothing, or so Jedediah had been telling himself for the better part of 3 days on the trail. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from hickory, and eyes the color of the creek water he was following now. A pale, shifting gray-green that had a habit of going very still when he was thinking hard about something. He had come from Missouri originally, the son of a blacksmith who had worked himself into an early grave and left Jedediah with nothing but calloused hands, and the understanding that a man had to grab his own future by the collar, or it would walk right past him. He had spent 3 years as a cattle hand on the Kishom Trail, 2 seasons grading railroad ties out of Wichita, and 1 miserable winter trapping beaver up near the Solomon River before he had sat down at that saloon table and decided his luck was about to change direction. He crested a low rise, and there it was. The homestead sat in a gentle bowl of land where the creek made a wide bend, surrounded by a stand of cottonwood trees that were putting out their first pale green leaves in the April warmth. The house itself was a solid-looking structure, hewn timber with a stone chimney, larger than he had expected. There was a barn in reasonable condition, a chicken coop, a kitchen garden plot that had been turned over and was showing early spring shoots, a woodpile that was stacked with fresh cut wood, and smoke coming from the chimney. Jedediah pulled Persimmon to a stop and stared at the smoke for a long moment. Crook Hannigan had failed to mention that someone was home. He rode down slowly, his hand resting easy near the rifle in his saddle scabbard but not touching it, because he was not the kind of man who arrived anywhere with a weapon drawn if he could avoid it. He got within 20 yards of the front porch when the door opened, and a woman stepped out with a shotgun leveled at his chest, with the kind of steadiness that told him she had held one before. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair that was pinned up but coming loose in places where the morning wind had worried at it. She wore a practical brown skirt and a white blouse with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she had flour on her forearm, and her boots were good quality, worn down at the heel but resolute. Her eyes were brown, nearly black in the morning shadow of the porch overhang, and they were watching him the way a hawk watches something moving in tall grass. "I do not know you," she said. Her voice was clear and direct, with a slight formality to it that made him think she had schooling behind her. "State your business or turn that mule around." "Ma'am," Jedediah said carefully, keeping his hands where she could see them, "my name is Jedediah Underwood. I have a land deed for this property. I obtained it legally 3 days ago in Dodge City." The shotgun did not waver. "Then whoever sold you that deed sold you something they had no right to sell, because this land is mine. My name is Fannie Barrett, and I have been living on this homestead for 11 months. There was a silence between them then that felt like the whole prairie was holding its breath. A meadowlark called somewhere in the cottonwoods. Persimmon shifted his weight and blew out a long breath. "I reckon," Jedediah said slowly, "that we have a problem." Fannie Barrett lowered the shotgun by perhaps 2 inches, not all the way down, just enough to indicate that she was willing to have a conversation before she shot anybody. "I reckon we do," she said. "You had better get down and come inside." because this is going to take some explaining, and I am not going to stand on this porch all morning." He tied Persimmon to the fence post and followed her inside, and the first thing that struck him was how lived in the place was. Not just inhabited, but genuinely made into a home. There were curtains at the windows, simple but neatly hemmed. There was a braided rag rug on the floor by the hearth. There were books on a shelf, 3 of them, which was more books than he owned. There were dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the smell of fresh bread coming from the iron stove, and a cat sitting on the windowsill regarding him with magnificent indifference. Fannie Barrett set the shotgun beside the door, within easy reach, and then turned to face him with her arms crossed. She was not a small woman, he noticed, but she was fine-boned with a kind of contained energy about her, like a fire burning low but very hot. There were calluses on her hands that matched his own. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to one of the 2 chairs at the wooden table. He sat. She did not. "That deed," she said, "belonged to Crook Hannigan, and Crook Hannigan had it because my late father, Henry Barrett, borrowed money from him 7 years ago before we ever came west. My father died last spring. Crook Hannigan came to this homestead 6 weeks after my father was buried and told me that the land had been put up as collateral on that debt, which I did not know, and which I believe my father did not fully understand either, because my father was a good man but not a careful reader of legal documents. I told Crook I would pay the debt. He gave me 60 days to do it." "And the 60 days?" Jedediah asked. Something moved briefly across her face, quick and controlled. "They ran out 3 weeks ago. I was $12 short. When I next went to Dodge City to find Crook Hannigan, he was gone, and I did not know what had become of the deed." She paused. "Now I do." Jedediah looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He thought about the $43 in his saddlebag, and he thought about the deed in his breast pocket, and he thought about Crook Hannigan, who had apparently not been half-drunk so much as fully crooked. "How much was the original debt?" he asked. $40 with interest. It had grown to 78, she said. "I had 66. I was 3 weeks from having the rest when the 60 days ended." He was quiet for a moment. The cat jumped down from the windowsill and came to sniff at his boot. "I won that deed fair and square," he said. "I am not saying I knew any of this. I did not." "I believe you," she said, and the directness of it startled him. "You do not have the look of a man who would do this deliberately. You look more like a man who got handed something bad and does not yet know how bad it is." That was, Jedediah reflected, an extremely accurate description of his situation. "I have $43, he said. She stared at him. "In my saddlebag," he said. "If I give you that along with what you have, does it cover the debt?" She was silent for a moment that stretched out long and complicated. The fire crackled. The cat sat down on his boot and began washing its ear. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly. "Because," he said, looking up at her, "the way I understand it, this land is yours. You built that woodpile, you planted that garden, you put those curtains up. I won a card game and I got handed a paper, and that paper may say one thing, but you are what is real here." He paused. "Also, Crook Hannigan cheated me, and I find I am not inclined to let him profit from it." Fannie Barrett was quiet for a long time. Her brown eyes were working through something complex and careful, and Jedediah got the impression that she was not a woman who accepted help easily, that she had been managing alone long enough that someone offering assistance felt more foreign than threat. "If you give me the $43, she said at last, "you have no homestead, and you clearly rode a long way." "I did," he agreed, "and you have nowhere else to go." He considered lying about that, then decided against it. "No," he said, "not particularly." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she did something unexpected. She turned to the stove and picked up the bread that was sitting cooling on the iron trivet, and she cut 2 thick slices and brought them to the table and set one in front of him and one in front of the other chair, and then she sat down. "Eat something," she said. "You look like you have been riding on empty since yesterday." He had been. The bread was the best thing he had tasted in 3 weeks. They sat there in the morning quiet, the 2 of them, with the fire and the cat and the meadowlark outside, and Jedediah felt something shifting in him that he could not quite name, something that had been clenched hard for a long time beginning, very slowly, to ease. "The barn needs a new crossbeam," Fannie said, as if continuing a thought she had already begun. "The back fence line is down in 2 places. The north field should have been plowed 2 weeks ago, and I cannot do it alone because my horse, Clover, is not a plow horse, and I have not been able to afford to hire anyone." He looked at her over his bread. "Is that an offer of something?" Her chin came up slightly. "The homestead is mine," she said. "The deed issue needs to be resolved properly at the county land office, which means a trip to Dodge City. But while that is being sorted, if a man were to work the land in exchange for room in the barn and a share of what the farm produces, that would be a sensible arrangement." "Room in the barn," he said. "The barn has a dry loft," she said. "It is perfectly habitable." He looked at his bread again. He thought about the barn loft and the $43 and Crook Hannigan somewhere out there in Kansas, probably already spending whatever Jedediah had lost to him. He thought about the north field that needed plowing and the fence that needed mending and the crossbeam that needed replacing. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They shook hands across the table, and it was a businesslike handshake, firm and brief, but Jedediah noticed that her hand was warm and that she held the grip a half-second longer than necessary before she let go, and he thought that maybe she noticed it too, because she looked down at her bread after. He moved into the barn loft that afternoon, which was indeed dry and had a straw mattress that was only slightly lumpy, and spent the remainder of the daylight hours assessing what needed doing. The list was longer than he had expected. The farm was in overall good condition, which spoke well of Fannie Barrett's capability and will, but there were things that simply required more than one pair of hands, and it was clear she had been fighting the land alone since her father died. He found her father's grave behind the house, marked with a wooden cross and a smooth stone on which someone had scratched the words Henry Barrett, good man and good father. The lettering was careful and deliberate, and Jedediah thought that Fannie had done it herself, probably with a nail and a great deal of patience, and something about that image of her kneeling in the cold spring ground doing that particular slow, careful work made his chest feel tight in a way he was not going to examine too closely. He started on the fence the next morning at first light, working from the southwest corner of the property where 2 posts had rotted through and the wire had gone slack. Fannie brought him coffee at 8 o'clock without being asked, strong and black the way he drank it, which either meant she had simply made it strong for herself or she had paid attention. He thought it was the latter and was pleased by it in a way that seemed disproportionate for a cup of coffee. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She stood watching him work for a moment. "You are doing it wrong." He looked at the fence post. "I have done a fair amount of fencing." "I can see that," she said, in a tone that suggested she could also see that he was still doing it wrong. "The soil here is different from further east. It is sandier. You need to pack the base with rock before you set the post, or it will rotate when the freeze comes next winter." He looked at the post. He looked at her. "Show me," he said. She took the post hole digger from him and showed him quickly and efficiently, and he watched the way she moved, economical and sure, wasting nothing. When she handed the digger back, their fingers overlapped on the handle and they both went still for a moment before she stepped back. "There is rock along the creek bed," she said. "I keep a pile of it near the barn." "I will get some," he said. "I know you will," she said, and walked back toward the house. He worked the fence line for 2 full days and then turned to the barn crossbeam, which required him to build a temporary support structure while he replaced the rotted timber, a job that took the better part of 4 days, and during which Fannie appeared at various intervals to hand him tools or hold things steady or offer a suggestion that invariably turned out to be correct. She had a practical intelligence that he found immediately compelling. Not the kind of intelligence that announced itself, but the kind that simply solved problems in front of it and moved on. On the evening of the 5th day, he came to the house for supper, which she had cooked as she did every night, a simple meal of salt pork and cornbread and greens from the kitchen garden. and she poured him a glass of water from the pitcher, and they ate together at the table, the way they had been doing, and Jedediah realized that the arrangement had settled into something comfortable with remarkable speed, that he looked forward to the supper hour in a way that had nothing to do with the food. "Tell me about your family," he said, "if you do not mind." Fannie considered this while she chewed. "My mother died when I was 12, she said. Consumption. My father moved us from Ohio to Missouri when I was 16 and then out here when I was 21. He had a dream of farming land that belonged entirely to us, not tenant farming, not borrowed land. He wanted to look at something and know it was ours." She was quiet for a moment. "He got 3 years of it before he died. I like to think that was enough." "What was he sick with?" Jedediah asked. "His heart," she said. "It just wore out. He worked too hard all his life." She looked at her plate. "He taught me to read when I was 4, and to do sums when I was 6, and he taught me to set fence posts and mend leather and read the weather and plant by the moon, because he said he did not know whether I would have a husband one day or not, and he was not going to send me into the world without the tools to manage either way." "He sounds like a remarkable man," Jedediah said. "He was," she said simply. "My father was a blacksmith," Jedediah said. "He worked himself to death too." "Maybe it is something fathers do." "Maybe," she said. "Did he teach you things?" "He taught me to shoe a horse and mend metal and recognize when something was too far gone to fix and when it just looked that way," Jedediah said. "Mostly the latter. He was an optimist about broken things." Fannie smiled at that, the first full smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face in a way that made him look down at his plate suddenly because he did not want to stare. The days found their rhythm. He was up before dawn and working by the time the light was good enough to see by. He plowed the north field with Persimmon, who turned out to have unexpected talents in that direction, slow and steady, and not prone to being startled by groundhogs the way Fannie's mare Clover was. Fannie planted behind him, dropping seeds with practiced care, and they worked together in the field for 3 long days with the spring sun warm on their shoulders and the smell of turned earth around them. And the conversation that developed between them in that time was easy and unhurried, moving from the practical to the personal and back again without strain. He learned that she had read every book she could get her hands on, that she had taught herself to set bone by practicing on a stray dog she had found with a broken leg, that she could shoot a rifle more accurately than most men he had known, that she was afraid of nothing she could see clearly but was sometimes kept awake by the things she could not, the uncertainty of the future, the fragility of what she had built alone. She learned that he played harmonica badly but enthusiastically, that he had once read half of a novel called Moby Dick and never finished it because a fellow bunkmate had burned it accidentally in a campfire, and he had never found another copy, that he could cook exactly 3 things with any competence, that he had never been in love, that he had never stayed anywhere long enough to consider it. Why not? She asked one afternoon, pausing in her planting to look at him as he walked Persimmon back along the furrow. "Were you not ever tempted to stop somewhere?" He thought about it seriously, the way she seemed to prefer, not just a quick deflection. "I think I did not know what I was looking for," he said finally. "When you do not know what you are looking for, you keep moving because maybe it is just over the next hill, but moving starts to feel like just moving after a while." She was quiet for a moment, her hand in the seed pouch. "And now?" she asked, and her voice was careful in the way it got when she was asking something she was not entirely sure she wanted the answer to. "Now I am not sure I need to look over any more hills," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she went back to planting, but her ears had gone pink, and he noticed, and he turned Persimmon around before she could see that he had noticed, because he was not sure yet what to do about any of it. The trip to Dodge City came in the 3rd week. They went together in Fannie's wagon, which was more practical than Persimmon for the journey, with the deed and the papers Fannie had kept relating to the debt, a careful collection of documents she had folded into an oilskin envelope and kept in her father's old document box. They left at first light, and the drive took most of the day across the flat grassland with the sky enormous overhead and the wagon rocking gently on the rutted track. They talked the whole way, and Jedediah could not have said afterward what most of it was about, only that it felt like the easiest conversation of his life, punctuated by long, comfortable silences that neither of them felt the need to fill. At one point Fannie fell asleep sitting up, the way people do on long journeys, her head tipping slowly sideways until it came to rest on his shoulder, and Jedediah sat very still and did not move for the next hour even though his left arm went to sleep, because she had relaxed against him in sleep in a way she would not have done waking, and that felt like something precious and fragile that he did not want to disturb. She woke up when they hit a rough patch of road and sat up quickly with a color in her cheeks. "I apologize," she said. "Do not," he said. She looked at him sideways and then back at the road ahead, and neither of them said anything else about it. Dodge City was loud and dusty and smelled of cattle and commerce, and Jedediah had always found it overwhelming after too much open country. But Fannie moved through it with the contained efficiency she brought to everything, steering them directly to the county land office without being distracted by the noise or the crowds or the three cowboys having what appeared to be a heated argument outside the harness shop. The land office was presided over by a clerk named Mr. Elias Potts, a thin man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers who took Fannie's documents and Jedediah's deed and spent a long, excruciating time comparing them against a ledger book the size of a church Bible. What emerged from that examination was complicated. The original debt had been recorded legally, which meant Crook Hannigan had in fact held the deed as collateral. However, Fannie had made partial payments that had reduced the debt, and Crook had failed to record those payments anywhere official, which meant the remaining balance was disputed. Furthermore, the deed Crook had given Jedediah in the card game had been signed over improperly, missing a required witness signature which made it legally questionable. "In short," Mr. Potts said, looking at them over his spectacles, "the situation is a mess." "I can see that," Fannie said calmly. "What does it take to make it not a mess?" What it took, Potts explained, was a payment of the properly documented remaining balance, which he calculated at $26 after accounting for Fannie's recorded payments, combined with a new deed to be properly recorded in Fannie Barrett's name, which would cost a filing fee of $3. $29 total. Jedediah had $31 left after Fannie had used 12 of his 43 to round out her own savings and pay off the bulk of the debt the week before. He paid it before Fannie could object, and she did object, turning to him with something sharp in her eyes. "That is your money," she said quietly, in a voice that was steady but very firm. "I know it," he said. "Jedediah, Fannie," he met her eyes, "let me do this one thing." She was quiet for a long moment, and he could see the struggle in her, the pride and the practicality and something else beneath them both that she was not ready to name. Then she turned back to Mr. Potts. "Very well," she said. The new deed was made out to Fannie Barrett, properly witnessed and recorded. She held it when it was handed to her, and looked at it for a moment with an expression on her face that he would not forget as long as he lived, something between grief and gratitude and relief, so deep it was almost pain, because her father had wanted this piece of paper, this incontrovertible fact of ownership, and she had gotten it for him even if he was not there to see it. Jedediah looked away and gave her that moment alone. On the way back, as the sun dropped red and orange over the flat horizon and the wagon moved through the cooling evening air, Fannie said, "I will pay you back, every dollar." "I know you will," he said. "Although I was rather hoping you would simply agree to keep me around long enough to make it worth my while." She looked at him sideways. "The barn loft is still available," she said. "That is not entirely what I meant," he said, another sideways look, longer this time. "I know," she said softly. They rode in silence for a while. The first stars were coming out. "My father liked you," she said suddenly. He looked at her. "Your father is gone, Fannie." "I know," she said, "but I mean he would have." I know exactly the kind of man he would have liked, because I spent 23 years watching him choose who to trust, and you are that kind." She paused. I wanted to say that. I have been meaning to say it. He was quiet for a moment, because the thing in his chest was doing something complicated, and there was pressure behind his eyes that he was not going to let turn into anything embarrassing. "Thank you," he said. "That means more than you know." She reached over in the dark and found his hand on the reins and covered it with hers for just a moment, a brief warm pressure, and then she took her hand back and looked at the road ahead. He was fairly certain something had just changed between them, though he could not yet have said exactly what or how, only that it had, and that it was the best thing that had happened to him in 28 years. The following weeks brought more work, as spring always does on a working farm. The corn came up strong in the north field, and the kitchen garden was producing generously, and the chickens were laying well, which meant Fannie had eggs to sell at the small trading post 6 miles down the road run by a man named Abe Coulter, who also took dried herbs and occasionally fresh produce. Jedediah repaired the roof of the chicken coop, which had developed a leak, and built a proper gate for the kitchen garden to replace the makeshift arrangement of boards Fannie had been using, and put new shoes on Clover when the mare turned up lame one Tuesday morning. Fannie watched him work the shoe on and shook her head. "I did not know you could shoe a horse." "My father was a blacksmith," he reminded her. "I keep forgetting how useful you are," she said, and there was warmth in it that she was no longer bothering to conceal entirely. He grinned at her over Clover's back. "That is possibly the most flattering thing you have said to me." "Do not let it go to your head," she said, but she was smiling. There was a neighbor, Tom Aldridge, who farmed about 2 miles north, a widower in his 50s with a boy of 13 named Pete who came around sometimes to trade labor, and who had been keeping a careful eye on Fannie Barrett's situation since Henry Barrett died. He was a decent man, Jedediah decided quickly, the kind who showed up when something needed doing and did not talk about it afterward. He came by one morning with Pete and a spare plow blade and stood in the yard talking to Jedediah with his hat in his hands, and after a while he said, "You fixing to stay on here, son?" "That is my intention," Jedediah said. Tom looked at the house, at the plowed field, at the repaired fence line. "She is a good woman," he said. "Had a hard year, harder than most folks would have managed." "I know it," Jedediah said. Tom nodded slowly. "See that you keep knowing it," he said, and then he and Pete went back to their wagon, and Jedediah understood that this was the nearest thing to community approval he was likely to receive and felt unreasonably gratified by it. June arrived with heat that shimmered off the flat land in waves, and the work shifted and intensified, and they were outside from dawn to dusk most days. And in the evenings they sat on the porch in the cooler air, and Jedediah played harmonica badly, and Fannie read or mended or sometimes just sat with her head tipped back looking at the stars. The conversation between them had grown into something rich and layered, the way conversations do between people who are paying genuine attention to each other. And there were long threads running through it that picked up from one evening and continued the next. And Jedediah found himself thinking about the things she had said during the day, turning them over, waiting to get back to the porch to continue. It was on one of those June evenings, with the fireflies starting in the long grass and the heat still rising off the boards of the porch, that she said, "Can I tell you something that is difficult to say?" "You can tell me anything," he said, and meant it absolutely. She was quiet for a moment, her hands still in her lap. "When you rode down that hill the first morning," she said, "I was frightened. Not of you specifically, but of what you represented, which was the possibility of losing everything I had worked for, everything my father had worked for. I was ready to fight you on every inch of it." "I know," he said. "The shotgun indicated that." "But then you came inside," she said, "and you ate my bread, and you looked at my father's homestead with what I can only describe as respect. And then you offered to give me your last $43 for a piece of land that you had a legal claim to, and I thought." She stopped. "What did you think?" He asked very quietly. I thought, she said carefully, that this was an extraordinary kind of man, and then I thought that I was in a great deal of trouble because I was supposed to be managing alone, and I had decided that I was very capable of managing alone, and you were making that decision feel significantly less necessary than it had before. He was watching her profile against the darkening sky. Fannie, I am not finished, she said, still not looking at him. I also want to say that I am not the kind of woman who has romantic notions about people she has known for 2 months. I am practical, and I have had to be, and I am not sorry for it. But I would be lying if I said that the past 2 months have not been the least lonely I have felt since my father died, and I would be lying if I said that has nothing to do with you specifically. The harmonica was loose in his hands. He set it down on the porch railing. Can I tell you something difficult? He asked. She turned to look at him then, and in the blue-gray light of the summer evening, her eyes were very dark and very steady. I have been trying to figure out how to say it for 3 weeks, he said, which is not like me. I am generally a direct person. But this homestead was not in any plan I had, and you were not in any plan I had, and somewhere around the second time you corrected my fencing technique, I realized that I had stopped thinking about any plan that did not include both of them, and that scared me somewhat because it is not a feeling I have had before, and I did not entirely know what to do with it. What did you decide to do with it? She asked, and her voice was very quiet. I decided, he said, that I was going to tell you the truth, which is that I think I am falling in love with you, Fannie Barrett, and I have been since approximately the morning you offered me bread when you had every right to shoot me. The fireflies moved in the long grass. Somewhere out past the cottonwoods a night bird called. The bread was not generosity, she said, and there was something soft and a little wondering in her voice. I was trying to keep you talking long enough to figure out if you were honest. I needed more time to look at you. And he said, and she said, I have had 2 months now. She looked at him steadily. I think I fell a great deal sooner than I was ready to admit. I think I fell somewhere around the moment you said the land was real and the deed was just a paper, because no man who was not genuinely good says something like that. He reached over slowly and took her hand, and this time she did not take it back. Her fingers curled around his and held, and they sat like that in the warm June dark with the fireflies and the night bird and the whole enormous Kansas sky overhead. And Jedediah thought that no hill he might have ridden over and nothing beyond it could have been better than this exact moment on this exact porch with this exact woman. I want to court you properly, he said, if you will permit it. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. Jedediah, you have been eating supper at my table every night for 2 months, and you have given me most of your money, and you have mended every broken thing on this farm. I believe that constitutes a courtship by any reasonable definition. Then I want to do the next part properly as well, he said. She was quiet for a moment. What is the next part? I would like to ask your permission to ask you to marry me, he said. Not the question itself yet, because I think that deserves a better moment than this, but the permission to ask it eventually. She looked at him for a long time in the dark. You are asking permission to ask permission, she said. I am a careful man. You are a ridiculous man, she said, but she was smiling, and her hand tightened around his. Yes, you have permission. Summer deepened and the corn grew tall and the farm prospered in ways that had more to do with 2 pairs of hands than with any extraordinary season, and the courtship that Jedediah had formalized with such careful protocol became the texture of their days, small and constant and unceasing. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bank, not grandly but quietly, setting them in the window jar without comment. She saved the best of the reading lamp oil for the evenings when they sat together, and she read to him from her books, which turned out to be a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, a natural history of North America, and a novel by a woman named George Eliot that was full of the most agonizingly precise observations about human feeling that Jedediah had ever encountered. They argued sometimes because they were both people of strong opinion, and the arguments were spirited but never cruel, and always resolved by morning, usually with someone admitting grudgingly that the other had a point. He argued that the rye should be planted before the winter wheat, and she argued the reverse, and she turned out to be correct, and he said so, and she did not gloat about it, which he appreciated. She argued that the money from the egg sales should go entirely into the repair fund, and he argued that she should spend some of it on herself, and she told him that was not practical, and he said that practically was not the highest value in all situations, and she thought about that for 2 days, and then showed up one evening in a new blouse she had ordered from the dry goods store in town, blue, the color of the creek on a clear day, and she had done her hair differently. And she looked at him with a slight challenge in her eyes, as if daring him to comment. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," he said, and he meant it so plainly that she could not doubt it, and she looked away quickly, but she was smiling. Tom Aldridge came by in late July with Pete and a third person, a woman named Clara Hester who lived 4 miles south and had brought a jar of preserves as a neighborly gesture, and who spent rather a lot of time looking assessingly between Jedediah and Fannie in a way that told him the neighborhood had opinions about their situation. Clara was a direct woman, somewhere around 40, with a matter-of-fact friendliness that Jedediah liked immediately. "You two planning to make this arrangement official?" Clara asked, during the lunch Fannie had put together from the garden. "Clara," Tom said, "I am asking because I am practical, not because I am nosy," Clara said, "though I am also a little nosy. This is a small community and people are wondering." Fannie looked at Jedediah across the table with an expression that was both exasperated and amused. He looked back at her with what he hoped was an expression that said he was working on it. "Things are developing at their own pace," Fannie said carefully. "Well," Clara said, "I hope that pace picks up." "You have been alone long enough, Fannie Barrett, and this one," she gestured at Jedediah with her fork, "clearly has good sense about him, and those are rarer than people think." After their guests had gone and Fannie was washing dishes and Jedediah was drying them, he said, "Clara Hester is not wrong." "About which part?" Fannie said without looking up from the pot she was scrubbing. "About the pace," he said. She handed him the pot and looked at him. Her sleeves were wet to the elbow and there was a soap bubble caught in her hair, and she was entirely, perfectly lovely. "I have been thinking," he said, setting the pot down carefully, "about the question I asked permission to ask." She was very still. "I have about $2 to my name," he said. "I own a mule and a harmonica and a change of clothes and a skill set that is mostly useful for fixing broken things. I cannot promise you comfort or security because those are not things any man can promise honestly in this country right now. But I can promise you this particular farm and this particular life, and that I will never stop showing up for either, and I can promise you that you will never be alone again in any of the ways that matter." He took a breath. "Fannie Barrett, will you marry me?" She was looking at him with those dark, steady eyes, and he watched something move through them, something complex and deep and finally resolved. "Yes," she said. "I will." She paused. "I also want to say that I do not need comfort and security from you. I built most of what we have on this farm. What I need from you is what you have been giving me since the morning you rode down that hill, which is someone who sees me properly and shows up anyway." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding carefully in check for 3 months, and the soap bubble in her hair transferred to his chin, and neither of them noticed or cared. They were married on a Saturday in August in 1879, in the yard of the Homestead, because that was where they both wanted it, under the cottonwood trees with the farm spread around them and the creek glittering in the distance. Clara Hester stood up with Fannie, and Tom Aldridge stood up with Jedediah, and Pete Aldridge spent most of the ceremony trying to coax Persimmon away from the food table. The preacher came from Dodge City, a round, cheerful man named Reverend Moss, who had married a great many Kansas settlers and had a wholehearted appreciation for outdoor weddings. Fannie wore her blue blouse and had pinned wildflowers into her hair, small yellow ones from the creek bank, and she walked out of the house and across the yard to where Jedediah was standing, and she was looking only at him, and he was looking only at her, and everything else, the neighbors who had come from miles around, the dust on the yard, the chickens who were being unceremoniously excluded from the proceedings, all of it fell away. When Reverend Moss asked if they took each other, they both said yes with the kind of certainty that made the Reverend smile and Tom Aldridge look at his boots in a moved sort of way. Jedediah took Fannie's hand and put on it the only ring he had been able to afford, a simple silver band purchased from the jeweler in Dodge City for $1.80, and she held it up and looked at it in the August sunlight and then looked at him. "It is perfect," she said. "I will get you a better one," he said. "You will not," she said firmly. "This one is exactly right." He believed her. The wedding supper went on until the stars came out, with Clara's preserves and a cake that Fannie had made herself, and Tom's contribution of a bottle of genuinely fine whiskey that he claimed had been waiting for an occasion worthy of it. Pete played the fiddle after dark, surprising everyone with a skill he had apparently been concealing, and the dancing that followed was enthusiastic if not technically accomplished, and Jedediah danced with his wife in the firelight under the cottonwood trees, and thought that he had never done anything in his life that made as complete a sense as this. The autumn that followed was the happiest work Jedediah had ever done. There was the harvest, which took all of September, and the putting up of stores for winter, and the repair of the chimney that Fannie had been worried about since spring, and the construction of a proper root cellar that would keep the winter vegetables better than the current arrangement. They worked side by side from morning until dark, and then they sat together in the evenings in the house that was now undeniably and completely theirs. Both names on the deed in the county office, both names on the land that Henry Barrett had dreamed into being, and Fannie had held onto through difficulty and grief and pure stubborn will. Jedediah taught himself the names of every plant Fannie grew and the properties of every herb she dried, and she taught herself the finer points of metalworking, because he had set up a small forge in the barn to shoe the horses and mend equipment, and she thought it was interesting, and he showed her everything he knew. They read to each other in the evenings, working through the Shakespeare and the George Eliot, and then ordering 3 more books from a catalog that passed through the trading post, which arrived in November and caused a celebration somewhat disproportionate to the occasion. The cat, whose name turned out to be Governor, for reasons Fannie said were lost to history, became Jedediah's devoted companion in the way cats sometimes attach themselves to the person least seeking their attention. Governor slept on the end of the bed and expressed strong opinions about Jedediah's work schedule by sitting on his boots when he got up before dawn. In November, Fannie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, early morning, with the same direct steadiness she brought to everything, and he sat down on the chair because his legs had done something unexpected. "Jedediah," she said, watching him. "I am fine," he said. "I am more than fine. I'm trying to find a word for what I am, and finding that English is inadequate to the purpose." She laughed, which was his favorite sound in the world. He stood up and went to her and held her, carefully and completely, with his face in her hair, and she put her arms around him and held on, and there were no more words needed. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was hard, as Kansas winters were, cold that drove deep into the ground and snow that came sideways in the wind. But the root cellar was stocked, and the chimney drew clean, and the firewood was cut and stacked deep into the barn, and they managed through it together. Tom Aldridge and Pete came to check on them twice a month, and Clara Hester sent over a jar of her blackberry preserves just before the worst of the cold settled in, delivered by Pete on horseback with a note that said she was thinking of them and particularly of Fannie and her condition. Fannie's condition progressed steadily, and she refused to reduce her work any more than was strictly necessary, which drove Jedediah somewhat to distraction. He had taken on the heavier tasks without discussion, but she still managed the kitchen garden and the chickens and the herbal preparations she sold to Abe Coulter at the trading post, who sold them on to people passing through. "You are supposed to rest more," Jedediah said one February afternoon, finding her moving a barrel that he had expressly said he would move. "I am perfectly healthy," she said, "and I am bored. Rest is for people who have nothing to do." "You could read," he said. "I have read every book we own twice," she said. He ordered 2 more books from the catalog that week. The baby came in early April of 1880, on a morning that was still cold but had the promise of spring in it, the air thin and bright and the creek running high. Clara Hester had come to stay the last 2 weeks, sleeping in the barn loft that had once been Jedediah's, because she had brought 3 children into the world herself, and had helped with a dozen more, and Fannie had told her she would rather have her there than the doctor from Dodge City, whom she did not know. Jedediah spent 9 hours on the porch in the cold, doing absolutely nothing useful, which was the hardest thing he had ever endured. Tom Aldridge came by mid-morning, having heard from Pete, who had seen Clara Hester's horse, and sat with him for a while without saying much, which was exactly the right kind of company. When Clara opened the door and said, "Come inside, you ridiculous man, and meet your son," Jedediah was through the door before she finished the sentence. The boy was red-faced and furious about the world, and had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's determination already visible in the set of his jaw, and he was the most extraordinary thing Jedediah had ever seen. Fannie was propped up in the bed with her hair loose and her face exhausted and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, which given the circumstances was saying something considerable. "He is perfect," Jedediah said, looking from the baby to Fannie. "He is," she agreed. She looked at him. "Are you crying?" "No," he said. "Jedediah." "Not significantly," he amended. She held out her free hand and he took it and sat on the edge of the bed, and they looked at the baby together, this person they had made between them, this new and particular life. "What shall we call him?" he asked. "I thought Henry," she said, "for my father." "Henry," he said. He tried it out, looked at the baby with fresh eyes. "Henry Underwood." "Henry James Underwood," she said. "James for your father." He looked at her for a long moment. "You remembered my father's name," he said. "I mentioned it once in passing months ago." "I remember everything you tell me," she said simply. "I always have." He brought her hand to his lips. "Henry James Underwood it is," he said. Henry James Underwood was a vigorous and opinionated baby who slept approximately 3 hours less than anyone considered reasonable, and had clear views about mealtimes, about being set down when he preferred to be held, and about Governor the cat, whom he found endlessly fascinating. Governor bore this fascination with dignity. Spring rolled into summer, and the farm hummed with new life in every direction, the crops coming up strong, the kitchen garden abundant, the baby growing visibly week by week, and Jedediah finding in himself reserves of capacity for joy that he had not previously known existed. He was working harder than he had in his life and sleeping less than he preferred, and his days had the beautiful, grinding, particular satisfaction of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. He had a conversation with Tom Aldridge one June afternoon while they were working on a shared fence line between their properties, where Tom said, in his slow, deliberate way, that he had been thinking about taking on a second parcel of land to the east that was coming available, and that if Jedediah wanted to go in as a partner, there was good grazing land in it. Jedediah thought about it. He had a little money now, not much, but the farm was producing, and Fannie's herb business had grown through word of mouth to the point where she had regular orders from 3 different trading posts, and had once been paid for a tincture by a man who turned out to be a doctor from Wichita passing through, who had told her that her preparation was as good as anything he had used. "Let me talk to Fannie," he said. Tom nodded. "Of course," he said, in a tone that suggested he had expected nothing else and approved of it. Fannie listened to the proposal over supper with Henry on her lap, the baby gnawing contentedly on a piece of dried corn cob. "What is the cost?" she asked. He told her. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, calculating. "We can do it," she said. if we put the spring harvest funds toward it and nothing else goes wrong this season. Do you want to? He asked. More land means more work, she said, but it also means more security, and Tom Aldridge is a good partner prospect. She looked at him. Do you want to? I think it is a good opportunity, he said. But it is your farm, Fannie. It has always been your farm first. I will not take it in a direction you do not choose. She looked at him with that expression she sometimes had, the one that said she was seeing him very clearly and was pleased by what she saw. It is our farm, she said. And yes, let us do it. They did. The additional land expanded the operation to the point where they needed Pete Aldridge's help through the harvest season, and Pete, who was by now 14 and growing into someone useful and decent, was glad of the work and the wages. Clara Hester came by regularly and had developed a particular fondness for Henry James Underwood, who returned the sentiment by reaching for her hat every time she held him. The summer of 1880 was full and good and moved through them like a clear current, and by the end of it the farm was more than surviving, it was prospering. Jedediah had built an addition to the house, a second room for when Henry was old enough to need it, and had finished the forge setup in the barn properly, and had begun doing occasional work for neighbors, shoeing horses and mending equipment, which brought in additional income through the quieter winter months. Crook Hannigan appeared in October. Jedediah was at the forge when he heard Fannie's voice from the yard, and the tone of it brought him out fast, because there was a particular quality to it that he had learned meant something was wrong. He came around the corner of the barn to find Crook standing in the yard, looking travel-worn and somewhat diminished from the confident card player Jedediah remembered, hat in hand, talking to Fannie with the manner of a man who knows he is owed nothing and is asking anyway. Jedediah walked into the yard and stood beside Fannie and looked at Crook Hannigan without particular warmth. Crook looked at him and then back at Fannie. I came to apologize, he said. I know that is not worth much. But I heard you were doing well here and I wanted to say. He stopped, started again. What I did was wrong. I knew Henry Barrett did not understand what he was signing and I let him sign it anyway, and I knew the 60 days was shorter than what was fair and I did not record your payments right. And I sold the deed to this fellow, he nodded at Jedediah, knowing the situation was not clean. I did all of it and I know it. There was a silence. Henry James, sitting in his carry basket near the house, made a contented sound. Why are you here, Crook? Jedediah said. His voice was level. I am passing through, Crook said. Going east. I am done with this country. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper and held it out to Fannie. This is a receipt for the full amount of the original debt with all payments credited showing a zero balance, signed by me. I had it witnessed in Dodge City. He paused. You already have the deed right and proper, I know that, but I thought you ought to have this too, for the record. Fannie took the paper and looked at it. She looked at it for a long time, and Jedediah watched her face work through something complex. My father was a good man, she said. He trusted people because he himself was trustworthy. That should not have been used against him. No, Crook said, it should not have. I will not thank you for the paper, she said, because it is the least of what you owed. But I will tell you that I hope you are better going forward than you were coming here. Crook Hannigan put his hat back on. That is more than fair, ma'am, he said. He looked at Jedediah. You landed somewhere good. I know it, Jedediah said. Crook rode out and they watched him go, and Fannie stood holding the paper and Jedediah put his hand on the small of her back. Are you all right? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. I think I am, she said. I think that was the last piece of it. The last thing that was hanging. She folded the paper carefully and looked up at him. It is done now, properly done. Yes, he said, it is. She leaned into him briefly, just a moment, and then she straightened and went to pick up Henry James, who had decided that the conversation was boring and that someone ought to feed him immediately. That evening, Jedediah sat on the porch with the harmonica and played something that was not quite as bad as usual, and Fannie sat beside him with Henry on her lap, and the stars came out over the Kansas plain one by one, and the farm was quiet and whole and utterly their own. The winters and springs continued. Henry James grew from an opinionated baby into an opinionated toddler who was deeply interested in the chickens, the forge, the creek when he was supposed to stay away from it, and everything else he was cautioned against, with the specific tenacity of a child who has inherited stubbornness from both parents. He walked at 10 months and talked in full sentences by 2 years, which Clara Hester said was remarkable, and Jedediah said was not surprising given that his mother had never wasted a single word in her life, and appeared to have passed on an efficiency of language along with everything else. In the spring of 1882, Fannie told Jedediah there would be a second child. She told him in the kitchen again, same as the first time, with the same directness, though this time he did not need to sit down. He kissed her instead, immediately and with great feeling, and she laughed against his mouth. "You are more prepared this time," she observed. "I have had practice being unprepared," he said. "I thought I should try the other approach." The second child was a girl, born in November of 1882 with Fannie's dark eyes, and a remarkable quantity of auburn hair, and an air of serene authority that suggested she would be running the farm within the decade. They named her Alina Rose, Alina for no one in particular except that it suited her, and Rose because Fannie had planted roses along the south fence line that spring and they had come up magnificently. Henry James regarded his sister with the wariness of a person who has recently been dethroned and was not entirely at peace with it. But within a week, he had taken on a protective interest that settled into his character and stayed. And by the time Alina Rose could sit up on her own, he was her most committed audience and defender. Jedediah watched his children and his wife and his farm and felt, on a regular basis, the slightly vertiginous sensation of a man who has exceeded his own hopes. He told Fannie this one evening in the spring of 1883, when Alina Rose was asleep and Henry James was in bed, and the house was quiet, and they were sitting together at the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the sounds of the farm settling around them. "I did not know," he said, "when I rode over that hill with my mule and my deed, that I was riding toward everything I was ever going to need. I thought I was going to a piece of land." Fannie looked at him across the table. The lamp made warm shadows across her face, and she was 30 or thereabouts now, and she was more herself than she had been when he first met her, more settled in her authority and her happiness, and she was without question the finest person he had ever known. "You rode toward a woman with a shotgun," she said. "Yes," he said, "and the shotgun was significantly less interesting than the woman." She smiled. "You are still ridiculous," she said. "Consistently," he agreed. She reached across the table and took his hand the way she had in the wagon that first night coming back from Dodge City, palm over palm, her fingers curling around his. And this time she did not take it back. "I was so angry the morning you came," she said. "I had fought so hard for this place, for so long alone, and here came another person trying to take it. I did not know that you were the person who was going to give it back to me instead. Give me the deed properly, give me the partnership, give me the children, give me all of it." She paused. "I had already claimed this place in my heart long before you came. It was mine in the way that things are yours when you have bled for them. But I had not understood yet that a place could also be yours in the way it is when someone who loves you stands in it beside you." He could not immediately speak. He turned his hand over and held hers properly, both hands clasped together on the table in the lamplight. "This land is yours," he said finally. "It has always been yours. I just get to be on it with you." "You are not just on it," she said. "You are in it. You are in every fence post and every furrow and every repair and every season. You are in this house and in these children and in 11 years of mornings where I knew that you were going to get up and be there and do the work beside me." She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. "You are claimed, Jedediah Underwood. Just as I claimed this land in my heart before any deed said so, I claimed you before I ever admitted it. And I want you to know that." He brought her hand to his lips. "I was claimed long before I knew it too," he said. "The moment you corrected my fence post technique, She laughed genuinely fully, the laugh that he loved best because it was completely unguarded. That was about a fence post. It was about the kind of woman you are, he said. Someone who knows the right way to do things and will tell you so without apology. That used to be called stubborn, she said. Now it is called right, he said. Because you almost always are, she looked at him. Almost. The winter rye, he said. You were right about the winter rye. I was right about the south fence elevation. You were right about the south fence elevation, she admitted with great effort. But that was once. It was twice, he said. The second time was, do not push your luck, she said, smiling. He brought her hand up and kissed her knuckles and then her palm, and she looked at him across their joined hands in the lamplight with everything in her eyes, all of it, the whole of what they had made together. Come to bed, she said softly. The morning is going to come early. The morning always comes early, he said. It does, she agreed, and I am glad of it. He blew out the lamp and they went together through the quiet house, pausing to check on Henry James, who had kicked his blanket off as he always did, pulling it back over him, and then Alina Rose, who was sleeping with the perfect serenity of a child who has decided the world is satisfactory. Fannie tucked the blanket around her daughter's small form and stood for a moment looking, and Jedediah stood in the doorway watching Fannie do it, and the love that moved through him was so complete that it had no edges. They went to bed in the house that was theirs, on the land that was theirs, in the life they had built from a misunderstanding and a deed and a very well-timed offer of bread. And the Kansas night settled in around the farm, soft and enormous and dark, with the creek whispering in the distance and the cottonwood trees casting their shadows in the moonlight. In the years that followed, the homestead grew. The partnership with Tom Aldridge expanded. Pete Aldridge grew into a capable young man who eventually married a schoolteacher named Ruth, who came out from Ohio, and settled into the Kansas life with the same adaptable determination the frontier seemed to require of women. Clara Hester remained a fixture in their lives and at their table, opinionated and warm and deeply pleased with how things had turned out. Henry James Underwood, at 7, decided he wanted to be a blacksmith like his grandfather, based entirely on watching his father at the forge, and spent 2 years following Jedediah around the barn making small and mostly unhelpful contributions before demonstrating a genuine aptitude that made his father deeply pleased. Alina Rose, at 5, decided she would be a doctor, based on watching her mother tend to every injured or sick creature that came within range of the homestead, and no one who knew Alina Rose doubted for a moment that this is what she would be. The books kept coming, the orders from the catalog growing into a shelf and then 2, and Fannie read to her children the way her father had read to her. Everything, natural history and poetry and stories, and the house was full of words and argument and the particular happiness of people who like each other's company. On a Sunday in May of 1885, Jedediah Underwood stood at the south fence line of the property, the one he had mended that first spring, and looked at the farm spread before him in the golden afternoon light. The corn was already up. The kitchen garden was in full riot. The roses along the south fence were coming into bloom, pink and fierce, the same roses Fannie had planted the spring Alina Rose was born. The barn stood solid with its repaired crossbeam and its well-made gate. The house sat in the bend of the creek with smoke from the chimney and Fannie's blue curtains in the windows, and the sound of children inside. He heard the gate open behind him and Fannie came to stand beside him, her shoulder against his, both of them looking at the same thing. She had flour on her sleeve again, same as that first morning, and her hair was coming down from its pins in the same places, worked loose by the May wind. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "About the morning I rode over that hill," he said. "About how I had a deed and no idea what I was riding toward. And now," she said, he put his arm around her shoulders. "Now I know exactly where I am," he said, "and I am not going anywhere." She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, and they stood together looking at the homestead, at everything that had been built here from grief and stubbornness, and a card game and a shotgun and 2 cups of coffee and a long wagon ride and a band of silver and 2 children and 11 years of mornings. The deed in the county land office said Fannie and Jedediah Underwood, both names, both claiming. But she had claimed it first. This land, this life, this man she had not known she was waiting for. She had claimed it all in her heart before any of it had a name or a paper or a ring, in the way that people who love deeply claim things, quietly and completely, before they are ready to say it out loud. And he, who had ridden over that hill looking for a piece of land, had found something so much larger than that it had taken him all the years since to fully understand it, and he was not sure he was finished understanding it yet, and that seemed exactly right. The roses bloomed along the south fence. The children argued inside about something and then laughed. The creek ran over its smooth stones in the bend. The meadowlark called from the cottonwoods. And the homestead, which had belonged to Henry Barrett's dream, and then to Fannie Barrett's will, and then to the improbable, stubborn, beautiful thing that Fannie and Jedediah Underwood had made of it together, stood in the May afternoon light on the Kansas plain, completely and entirely claimed, warm all the way down to its foundations.